Hi, in this video I'll be sharing a few watercolor techniques in painting a simple seashore view. And while I paint, I also discuss using these simple pebbles and seashell, which I have used as a reference to paint this subject matter. So join me as I walk you through on the observations of the subject matter while demonstrating the techniques involved. So hello there and welcome back to Run My Arts watercolor tutorial series. So in this tutorial I'll be using Canson cold press watercolor paper of 300 grams per square meter, and the painting size is half of this A4 size, which is equivalent to A5 size, and the orientation is landscape. So I will be using 3 pebbles and 1 shell as a reference for my painting. So it will be easier for you to follow as I explain on the characteristics of each pebbles and how am I going to paint using the watercolor techniques. And over here I have pre-sketched the subject matter of the painting. Of course, it's slightly bigger than the actual pebble and shell. You can find the sketch file on my Pinterest account. I'll leave the link in the description section for you to go and download them, and I've also uploaded the photos as a reference for you to refer back to the color and the coordination. And my 2 main brushes are going to be a mop style as well as a normal round brush from Da Vinci. So the first pebble is of bluish gray tone, and it is not a very polished looking pebble. It has some patterns on it, like some small dots or some sort of texture on it. So I'm going to recreate the same look and also replicate the color, whereby I am going to use burnt sienna and sapphire blue to reach to the bluish gray color tone. If you don't have the sapphire blue, you can use a darker blue tone as in ultramarine blue. Okay, it looks almost the same and it's good to go. So I will be painting this pebble using the wet on dry method, which means I'm painting the wet paint directly onto the dry sketch of the subject matter. And as I paint this pebble, I am remembering to leave a gap for the white line that can be seen on this pebble. But if you do not wish to replicate exactly the same look of this pebble, go ahead, you can paint it fully in this gray tone. I'm just repainting the surface once again as I want it to look a bit darker, and once done I am going to drop in some granules of salt in order to create that patterns that was visible on the actual pebble. So referring back to the white line or gap that I've created on this pebble, it looked too sharp and too white, so I'm going to use a smaller brush whereby I have damped the brush with clean water, and I'm just lightly giving washes on the edges of the color so that they look much smoother and it doesn't stay too white and has a natural look on it. Alright, moving on to the second pebble, which is the beige colored or whitish colored pebble. However, I noticed that it has some hint of other colors, as in light pink or ochre. Hope you can notice from the screen there's some patches of color on this stone, which makes it look very interesting. And since it's a light colored pebble, it doesn't require too much of paint on it, so I'm going to paint this using the wet on wet technique, whereby I am pre-wetting the sketch with clean water. And while the sketch is still wet, I am going to drop in a little bit of paint, and I'm going to start off with the pinkish hint, whereby I have mixed burnt sienna with a little bit of carmine red. I'm just going to drop those colors using the tip of my brush, and since it was already pre-wet surface, you can notice that the color spreads smoothly. So I'm just randomly applying the paint so that it creates a similar look of the actual pebble. And I'm going to repeat this step by using a second color, which is yellow ochre. As I mentioned earlier, I noticed ochre and pink hint on this pebble. So I'm just using the same technique and just randomly dropping in here and there to create that patch of colors on this beige colored stone. And once I have coordinated those patch of colors, I'm using a clean damp brush to give them some light washes so that they have a much more smoother look and a lesser hint of the color. So just dab the excess water from your brush onto a dry paper towel and make the smooth washes on the applied paint. And if you notice your brush has been stained with paint and you don't want to spread those colors further, then just clean your brush and repeat the process. And I noticed there are some gray tone patches on the stone, but I will make them later once the painting is dry. And moving on to the third pebble, which is this small brownish pebble, I noticed there's some hint of dark brown and golden brown. So once again, burnt sienna comes to the picture, as since this is a beach painting and beach sand, so most of the time I'll be using this burnt sienna and yellow ochre to create this look. As you can see here, I'm mixing both these colors to arrive at a darker hue of the brown. So I am adding a little bit of sapphire to darken this entire palette. I'm going to paint it using the wet on dry technique, similar to the one that I used for the grey pebble. Adding in more burnt sienna and sapphire to arrive at a darker hint to paint the dark patch that is visible on this particular pebble. So since this is the most darkest colored pebble on this entire painting, I am going to lift out some paint to create a highlight on it, because it is definitely going to be visible on a dark colored element or subject matter. So assuming the light source is coming from the left, I am going to lift out a little bit of pigment on the left hand corner of the pebble. Using a smaller size brush, just lifting out those pigment lightly and absorbing it on a paper towel. So the next subject matter, which is a seashell, slightly challenging compared to the rest of the three pebbles. So as you notice, on the top half of the shell, there seems to be a lighter tone compared to the bottom half. So I'm going to give it a very light wash of paint, which is similar to a taupe. So I've mixed burnt sienna and yellow ochre with a hint of sapphire blue to arrive at a taupe color, and it has a very watery consistency because I want the first layer of this shell to look extremely light in color. And once again I am using the wet on dry technique to paint the shell. Just gonna give it some light washes of this paint. As I mentioned earlier, I want it to look really light in shade. And once this first layer of paint is dry, I will come back to paint the second or third layer. Alright, remember the grey patches that I noticed on this beige colored stone? Now the painting is completely dry, so I'm going to apply some light grey mixes onto this pebble, similar to the way I painted the other two colors, which is the ochre and the reddish pink. So I'm just applying it wherever I notice that dark patch. And once apply this color, this paint, I'm going to give them some light washes using a clean damp brush, similar to the earlier colors that are painted on this pebble. As you use this technique, by brushing on or giving light washes of the damp brush on your color patches, you'll realize that this technique results in hints of color. In other words, staining your painting, and it doesn't have too much of pigment on your painting. Alright, now I'm going to paint the second layer for the shell, since the first layer is completely dry. So I am going to kickstart painting the narrow part of the shell, which is also called the beak, where the shell part meets. I'm not so good with the parts of the shell. As you can see here, I'm just applying a thicker consistency of paint. As you can notice, the color darkness of the color just speaks for itself, that this is not a very watery consistency of the paint. So I'm using a smaller brush to apply paint on the narrow part of this sketch, and once applied, I am using a clean damp brush to drag in those pigment onto both corners of the shell. Next, in order to paint the darker tones on the bottom half of the shell, I'm adding in more burnt sienna to this paint mix. And I'm using the same small size brush to paint in those lines or pattern on the shell surface. As you can notice here, you can also use a script brush which has a very thin bristle to make it much more easier to paint all these fine lines. Once again, I am going to smoothen the upper part of the lines that are made by just giving it some light washes. And in order to do this, please remember to use a clean damp brush instead of a very soaked wet brush, because a soaked wet brush is going to add in more water and distort your painting. Next, I am going to retouch this brown pebble by darkening that dark patch it has on its surface, and I'm adding more sapphire to paint onto this pebble using a wet on dry method. And after applying the paint, as usual, I'm using a clean damp brush to give it some light washes, especially onto the corners of the paint to smoothen its look. Next, the grey pebble needs some retouches. So before I move on to the second layer of paint, I will have to scrape off the salt granules that I applied earlier. So remember, if you have applied some salt onto your wet painting, you can only remove them once the painting is completely dry. So notice the cool effects or patterns created by the salt granules onto the watercolor painting, and it has also left some separation of pigment, whereby I can notice the burnt sienna hint onto the patterns, simply because this color mix consists of a darker blue shade as well as burnt sienna. So if you don't wish to have this color separation, then you can skip the salt part and just leave it as it is, or you can also apply some droplets of water, as in using a spray bottle instead of using salt. So I am going to fine tune this grey pebble by creating some patches of darker grey tone, similar to the one that you notice from the original pebble. And in order to do this, I will have to mix a darker grey shade. So as you notice, I am adding in more blue shade as well as a little hint of sapphire to arrive darker grey hint. If you have an indigo palette, then you can right away use an indigo color as well to enhance the look of this pebble. So I am going to paint this dark shade onto this pebble, avoiding those marks or patterns that was created by the salt granules. So in order to do this, you will need a smaller bristle brush or a micro bristle brush that I'm using over here, in order to help you to apply the paint onto these narrow areas. So I'm just applying those wet paint onto the dry surface of this painting, avoiding those marks. And once done, I will be using the same brush but a clean version of it, clean and damp version of it, to give it some light washes to smoothen its look. And while painting, I am also dabbing the same color onto the white area of the stone to give it a natural look. Alright, now to fine tune the look of the shell, I'm going to use my script brush, which has a very thin and long bristle, also from Da Vinci. And this time I'm adding in more burnt sienna and a little bit of carmine to give it a reddish brown hint. And I'm going to paint, apply this paint onto the bottom part of the shell. As I apply this paint, I am going to leave a small gap in between so that the highlights on the dark area shows. You'll notice in a while, as I paint, I painted a little bit of the first half or top half of the line and the bottom half of the line, leaving a small gap, and automatically this creates a highlight or a light area, creating an impression of light or shimmer on the shell surface. Next, I am going to retouch the upper half of the shell surface by repainting the fine lines using a taupe color. And this time the taupe mix is slightly darker than the earlier layer that I painted. You can achieve this darker taupe mix by adding in the earlier grey mix that you have, or by simply adding a little hint of the darker blue shade. So at this point of time, I realized that I needed to create a much more stronger highlight on the surface of the shell. So I just used a clean damp brush to lift out some pigment. So I am going to apply the same technique onto the upper part of the shell by giving it some light washes using a clean damp brush, and then lifting out the pigment by pressing a dry paper towel on its surface. Finally, to enhance the look of this shell, I am adding in some sapphire with a hint of carmine red to arrive at a very reddish brown hint, as in like a wine color or burgundy. I'm using my script brush to just lightly paint on some part of the shell, especially on the lower part of the shell. Alright, since the brown pebble looks slightly dark, I would like to brighten it up by using the glazing technique, and I'm going to glaze a light mix of yellow ochre. And for the glazing technique, you don't want a very thick consistency of paint mix, you just want a little hint of the preferred color choice in a wet mix. So I think I'm happy with the look of the pebbles. Time to paint the beach sand. And once again, yellow ochre and burnt sienna will be the main color palette, as they are going to give a hint of those golden brown shade of beach sand. So just mix these two colors until you arrive at a golden hint of brown or yellow, or your preferred choice of color, and use that to paint the surface of the beach. And before you start painting them, I would advise you to use the wet on wet techniques, since you want a smooth look of the color spread. And in order to pre-wet the larger area of painting, I am using a larger size mop brush, also from Da Vinci. So I'm going to thoroughly wet the surface of this painting, avoiding those pebbles and seashell painting, and keep re-wetting the paper if you feel it is drying out quickly, because you can only nail a good wet on wet painting if your paper is thoroughly wet, because that will ensure a good spread of wet paint consistently throughout the entire painting or paper surface. And since it's a pre-wet surface and the paint spreads quite fast onto the wet paper, just have some brush control as you spread the paint across the painting, especially avoiding those areas that you do not wish to stain. And once again, I'm dropping in some granules of salt so that it makes some pattern similar to the one you notice on the pebbles. You can skip totally if you don't wish to have this effect, but I would love to have some marks on the beach sand, since that adds more character. So once the painting is completely dry, you can remove those salt granules if you had added on the painting. As you can see here, I'm just quickly removing that from the dry painting surface. And after this I am going to add some extra effect, such as dark areas or shadow, as a result of the uneven surface of the beach sand. As you all know, beach sands are not a very hard and leveled surface. Given the nature of the soft texture of sand, as well as the effect, hollow effect created by the sea waves onto the sand surface, especially in between the pebbles and seashells on the surface of the seashore. So I am going to paint these effects using a darker brown shade. Once again, it's a mix of the ochre and burnt sienna, with a more mix of the burnt sienna and a hint of sapphire to arrive at this darker brown shade, and using the wet on dry technique, and just randomly applying my brush strokes, just imagining how the dark areas would look like underneath or around the pebbles. So just do the same and be very casual about painting these effects. And after applying this paint mix, I am going to give them some light washes using a clean damp brush. So basically I am going to repeat the same technique onto all these remaining pebbles. Now I am going to paint a little bit of shadow, darkest area underneath these pebbles and seashell. I'm going to use the gray mix that I had earlier in this tutorial. As you can notice on the screen, I'm just adding in more paint since my palette has dried up, but basically it's the same gray mix that I've used earlier in this tutorial, and just painting onto the corners of some of these pebbles using the small tip brush, and finally giving it a light wash using a clean damp brush to soften the look of these dark shadows. And finally, to complete the look of this painting, I am making some paint spatters using my fan brush. You can use an old toothbrush just make a light mix of paint of your choice. I'm using the same dark shade of brown as well as a little bit of the gray mix to give it some contrast of some greens in the beach sand. So there you go, we have a completed painting of the pebbles and seashells. What do you think, guys? Do they resemble each other? Hope you liked this tutorial, and if you really think I've done a good job, then try it out. Try to recreate this painting. So apart from that, I also have made several beach paintings or seaside paintings. One of them is this sunset painting, where I've shared tips on how to nail a good watercolor painting, and I've also shared some mistakes actually, while I created this painting. So I think it will be worth it for you to watch. And also a very recent watercolor painting tutorial that I've posted is this underwater scenery with butterfly, fishes and coral effects, where I use sponge technique. So do check them out as well. And I also have some older videos of beach and ocean paintings which I did a few years back. So I will leave the link to those videos in the description as well, and you can check them out. Lastly, if you have become a fan of my work, then do hit the like and share button. It will help me to grow further. And also don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And thanks a lot for your support. See you again in another exciting tutorial. Bye.